Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Underwater Photography Show. As always, I'm Matthew Sullivan.
And I'm Alex Mustard.
And as of the time of this recording, Alex, you just came back from running back-to-back workshops at one of my favorite places in the world, God's Pocket Resort.
I have to say one of mine too, as well.
Yes. So today, you're going to tell us all about that. I will pepper you with questions when I have them, but I'll kind of let you take it away and talk about the trip. And if I have interjections, I will interject.
Yeah, well, it's one of my favorite places because it's a place that you don't get to go too much. You know, certainly if you don't live locally, there's a relatively short diving season there. They have a sort of a period in the spring when you can dive there when the visibility is good. Then in the summer, the water goes all green. And you can tell it's a murky destination because actually the kelp, although the water was very clear when we were there, the kelp actually doesn't extend very deep. And you can say, why isn't the kelp growing down at 50 feet when it's perfectly clear at 50 feet? And it's because most of the summer you can't see, your hand in front of your face. But they have this period of clear visibility in the spring and this period of clear visibility in the fall and the autumn time. I prefer to visit in the autumn. The water is marginally warmer in the autumn, but it's more that the kelp forests are mature. They're actually beginning to break down again. But the kelp is such an important part of the photography for me. And in the spring, it's kind of still in the growing phase. I like those big canopies of kelp, and so I've always gone in the autumn. There are some certain subjects that are better in the spring, the brooding anemones being one of them, which are a cool subject up there. And to be honest, I'm sure one day I will do a spring trip there, but I've always just gone in that window. The reason it's so not only do you have this narrow window, but God's Pocket Resort is the only resort in this area. There are a couple of boats that you sometimes either move up there or are based up there that allow day boat diving out there. And I would do that day boat diving because the diving is so good, but it's a long day out on a cold boat doing cold water diving without the ability to eat warm food in the middle of the day and that sort of thing. And also because you can only access some of the best dives at slack water, and there's 6 hours between those slacks. That's a lot. You're going to have a long day on the boat to get your dives in. So with all those things, God's Pocket is the standout way to do this, and everyone knows that. And there's only so many weeks that they're open for diving during the year, so it's always booked out. It's I think pretty much every month of the year is booked by one local dive shop or a photographer like me or that sort of thing. And that's really your only way to go. And I have to say, as someone who wants to go there, I leave basically going, I'll come back as soon as you can next fit me in, please. And that's kind of how, and it was 3 years since my last visit, and I suspect it will be similar length till I get back there again. So it's always right up there. And then it offers really unique special diving from a global perspective. That Pacific Northwest diving is amazing. But even within the Pacific Northwest, there's just something special about that area. It's a real concentration of amazing dive sites. And those dive sites have a concentration of life that you don't get in the other places. Just the fact that, and I'll run a video through some of this because there's just some of the GoPro clips that me and a few of the others on the workshop just filmed off the top of our housings when you can finally press the bloody on button through your dry gloves. And so it's not the world's most amazing footage, but it shows you what the diving is like. And it's that color that really, that the amount of life and the color that is just on every surface that makes it so special.
I think that's the thing, that last point you made, because I've done, I've done a lot of diving elsewhere in the Pacific Northwest, in Alaska and Washington and other parts of BC even. But the thing that always stands out about God's Pocket is there is life everywhere. Every inch of everything is covered with something alive. And it's often very colorful. And you don't get a lot of that. I mean, you can get patches of that here and there in other places of the Pacific Northwest. But it seems like everywhere you go in the area around God's Pocket is like that. And it's just spectacular underwater. And then you have all these cool critters that hang out there as well, which is just an extra bonus.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that I love about it, and say this to the workshop guys, is that it's every dive site there that they do is equally good for wide angle and macro. And I can't think of another place in the world that's like that, where you say, which lens should I use? Well, both. And the advice that I give to people there is to say, there's kind of 2 to 3 things that you should decide on the lens, and it's not the dive site. The dive site really doesn't matter because all the dives that they do up there are great for wide angle, great for macro. What makes the difference is if you have good visibility, then you should be strongly consider doing wide angle because it's not always that easy to get really good visibility up there. If the sun is out as well, you should definitely be doing wide angle because just the brighter light levels, but particularly the way the sun plays through the kelp forests, it adds that extra dimension to those the shots. And because the waters are generally very protected, because it's kind of a fjordic environment with lots of little islands, the water surface is normally smooth, so you often get very beautiful sunbeams and that sort of thing in the underwater world there.
I will.
And then the final factor, is do what you fancy doing. Like if someone says to you, you should do wide angle this dive, and you don't want to do it, you will just be annoyed by how many amazing macro subjects you see. And if someone forces you to do macro and you really want to do wide angle, so I said, you guys have to decide, on the dive. And whatever you go for it with both feet, fully in. And you're like, I don't care what macro I see on this dive. I'm shooting wide. I know I'm going to see some amazing macro subjects, but I'm going to focus on beautiful wide angle. And then if I'm on a macro dive, I don't care how many, and this trip, every time I put a macro lens on, I kept seeing GPOs, which is the giant Pacific octopus. And I was Mr. GPO finder, particularly on the second week of the workshop. Like almost, it felt like every dive I was seeing one, and almost always when I had a macro lens on. But yeah, actually, there was a nice one on our last day, which is just the last memory. Is I was on a GPO, and Dave Hicks, who's a very talented local photographer, was nearby, and I knew he had a wide angle and I had a macro on, so I waved to him and said, come and take over this GPO because you've got the wide angle on. And luckily for me, he was on a war bonnet, so we switched subjects because he had the wrong subject for his lens and I had the wrong subject for my lens, and we were literally arm's length apart, amazing subjects just there. And that's kind of the nature of it. So yeah, really good. I know you wanted to ask something, sorry.
I just wanted to say that because you said if you have really good wide angle conditions, shoot wide angle. And I've been up there a couple of times now, and I've been there in the summer and I've been there in the fall, and I've never had that great visibility. So it just goes to show that if you have the sun and good visibility, take advantage of it because there's no guarantee you're going to actually have it the very next day. But it also speaks to how amazing that place is that I've never been there with good conditions, and it's still one of my absolute favorite places just because of all the life.
Yeah, and when you do, so we were very lucky on this trip that we had good visibility. I have my sort of theories that we work for, and there is a general scene. The visibility will be bad in the summer, and then by the late autumn, the storms are going to come in and that starts to limit things as well. So you're trying to find those sweet spot weeks. And this year, the visibility cleared up it was kind of, although it'd been a very dry summer up there, the visibility cleared up quite nicely right at the beginning of September. And through September, they've had good visibility. Last time I went mid-September, and we had lovely weather, but there was just too much sun. And as soon as the sun is out, the water goes green and you lose the visibility. And luckily this year, there'd been a nice rainy week before we arrived. That really sorted out the visibility. I mean, the visibility would be generally good all autumn anyway. And so what you want there, strangely, is you want a mixed week with rain and sun. If it's all sun, you get green water. So you want rainy days, and then rainy day, you go, it's rainy, I'll go macro. And then in 2 days' time, the sun is out. And because the weather forecast is quite good up there now. And I would also point out that the weather in God's Pocket, the Port Hardy area in that northern Vancouver Island, is very different from further south. It's kind of a whole different weather system area. So, there's no point looking what the weather in Victoria or Campbell River is and going, oh yeah, it seems to be sunny all the time. It's like Port Hardy's not having that weather. But yeah, you get some rain. It tends to clear the water up. I also felt this trip, because I always do back-to-back workshops there because of the travel distance. And if you go there for 2 weeks, you're obviously going to get some time where you've got big tides and some time where you've got small tides. And my feeling is when you've got the big tides, you get better visibility. So people go, well, surely you should go aim for the neap tides, because when you've got those small exchanges, you're not so restricted on where you can dive at any point of the tide. And that surely must be better. And yes, that's better from a avoiding current point of view. But I felt when there were bigger exchanges, we were getting better visibility. Because I think those big exchanges suck. And actually it was actually low tide. So it was on the bottom of ebb that we got the best visibility of the trip. The visibility was good all the way through, but actually high tide slack wasn't actually that good for visibility. And then when we were on the neap tides and with smaller exchanges, it was kind of in the middle of the two, so it was kind of more consistent through the day, but without the really amazing, very clear water on dives. So I enjoy going for 2 weeks. I wouldn't say that I would, if I had to go for 1 week, I wouldn't necessarily target neap tides, the small exchanges, because the small exchanges mean that, on the very small exchanges, you can dive some of the sites that normally you can only dive on slack water. You can actually dive them on any state of the tide. And that is a nice thing. But I actually think you don't always get the best photography conditions on the neap tides, just because, chances are it's one extreme of the other of tide that gives them. And it's a very tidal area, which is why this is so important.
I think one thing that's also important to say is that if you're mostly just concerned about the actual marine life, that stuff is around all year. Like you said, there's certain things that are better in spring, better in fall, but the things that most people go up there for are there all year, regardless of the visibility. Like, they live there, they don't really care about that.
And it's the scenery as much as anything.
Yes. So there's still plenty of cool stuff to see, regardless of when you go. It's just if you can time it, spring and fall are those peak seasons for getting the good critters and the best visibility. But I know you also stopped in Campbell River on the way back, I think.
Yeah, on the way back this time, yeah.
Which is a salmon hotspot, another one of my favorite places. So did you manage to do any salmon photography while you were there, or did you guys just...
Yeah, I'm sorry, I'll let the side down on that and didn't photograph any salmon. I did photograph a couple of black bears who were feeding on the salmon, but it was right at the end of the day, and I almost didn't take my camera because it was really dark, because we'd been out diving. But it was interesting to dive there, because actually we were very lucky with conditions there as well. I think it's a good time of year to visit, is that sort of in the fall. And they were saying, wow, the visibility is really good for here, and it was really nice. It also there it was quite interesting to see the differences. It doesn't have that same every single piece of rock is covered in life. There also were it was really interesting to dive and photograph some of the urchin barrens there, because God's Pocket area, the Port Hardy area, over the last 10 years or so, they've had, really strong population of sea otters up there. And they definitely keep the urchin numbers well under control. And there aren't that many sea urchins in the God's Pocket area. And whereas heading further south, the area was around Campbell River. There were loads and loads of sea urchins. And I've not seen those urchin barrens where it's just wall-to-wall sea urchins. There was loads of colour beneath the barren. It was kind of in this gap between the main kelp forest and the bottom where the urchins were. But what lots of urchins bring is one of the well-known urchin predators, which are wolffish. Wolf-eels. Sorry, yeah. I think one of the things is quite interesting about God's Pocket is that, two of the star species of the Pacific Northwest habitat are giant Pacific octopus and wolf-eels. And I would say that God's Pocket isn't a bad place for seeing them. We saw them up there, no problem. But I don't think it's necessarily... I wouldn't... If I was shooting an assignment, you have to shoot wolf-eels or you have to shoot GPOs, I probably wouldn't do the God's Pocket diving for that. Because I don't think it's an area where typically you get loads and loads of octopus. Not on those really colourful sites. I think they actually prefer the kind of more broken down type of habitat. And, and again, I think, there's dives in other parts of Vancouver Island, in Washington State and that sort of thing, where I think you can get much more reliable encounters with those species. And it's the same with the wolf-eels, is that there are wolf-eels in God's Pocket area. And there can be some well-known ones at different times that can be good for photos. But in other areas, there are really well-known ones that are really used to divers, because people dive with them all year. And there's a lot more urchins, so you understand why there's a higher population density of wolf-eels. So I think if those are your absolute must-sees, it really makes sense to combine a trip to God's Pocket with some other diving in the region, particularly to tick off those. And that was really the motivation for going to Campbell River, was, instead of spending ages ignoring beautiful walls that you can only see in Browning Pass in God's Pocket, going down deep and looking for wolf-eels. Don't worry about looking for wolf-eels in God's Pocket, and then just arrange a nice dive somewhere else where that there are very reliable wolf-eels and you can go straight to them and take their pictures. And that's what we did in Campbell River, and it worked like a charm. And I was really happy to do that because it just filled out that extra section of the portfolio. 5 minutes with a friendly wall feel, and you have every photo you could ever want.
Yeah, exactly.
Mm.
It is truly wild, though, how relatively little space is between God's Pocket and Campbell River, for example, geographically, and how wildly different they are
Mm.
from a diving experience. Like, you don't go to Campbell River for nice scenery. Like you said, you go there for specific, animals, things like that, or salmon,
Yeah,
because it just looks completely
it's good for
different
octopus
to,
as well. It's like some of
yeah,
the,
not if you're
some
me,
shore
but
dives that, yeah.
other people, yeah.
Yeah, no,
um,
and the yeah. So I think what you do get with those species up in the God's Pocket region is the opportunity to shoot everything on those colourful backgrounds.
yeah,
And if you want a iconic Pacific Northwest picture, having an iconic Pacific Northwest species, but in that incredible environment, is even better than having that species on its own. It's great to have a GPO swimming across, seaweed, but how about having it on full color with lovely anemones and soft corals and sponges all around it. So
yeah,
yeah, it was a great trip. It was quite a long trip, doing back to back workshops. One of the things I love about God's Pocket is it's a very, very welcoming resort. It's only a small resort. It's run by a very small dedicated team. But it was 3 years since I last went, and God's Pocket is a little bit more expensive than it used to be. But I 100% feel that Klaus, the owner, is taking whatever excess they're making, and it's all going back into the business. And it's on things that you almost don't see. Like, they've completely reorganized like all the amenities. So they've got really nice, drinking water, coming out. They've got new mattresses in all the beds, which are really comfortable. That doesn't get you more bookings, putting new mattresses in. No one knows that until they get there and go, oh, these beds are really nice, but it doesn't, they're already full anyway. They employ a really, like, the other show, guy called Ken is the chef. He is a really, really talented chef. He's not just a good cook. Traditionally they always had really good food there because they got good ingredients, good cook, really nice food. Now they've actually got a really talented chef doing the meals, and it's just a pleasure every single meal you're looking forward to. And when you're cold and tired, those things make such a difference. They've really got excellent hot water now, so there's no
cool.
yeah, be careful about showering. Every room has an individual heater for the shower, so you can all have a shower
Oh, that's
at the
awesome.
same time, and everyone gets a hot shower, which is really important after a day of cold water diving and
Yeah,
things like that. I'm really impressed by how much work they've done on the resort since I last went there. And
I've
that's
always
just a
told
few
people
things. Yeah.
yeah, I've always told people God's Pocket is about like the whole experience of the place. It's not just the diving; it's
Mm.
getting to stay at that particular area or that particular spot in that area. Really contributes to the trip, and it sounds like it's changed a lot since I've last been there. And they were
Yeah.
making changes even back then. They just put in heated floors in all the cabins and things like that. So
Oh
it's
yeah,
cool that they're
and they work so
constantly,
well. Like, it's all like
yeah,
they've it's not, they've given that they're off the grid in the middle of nowhere. They had like 2 new refrigerators delivered. Well, actually, delivered. I was pushing them up the slope, but on the changeover day between the two groups, that's what they're really investing in, making the place, just better and better. And the
yeah,
thing I would say that sums it up for me, it is, it's been said for years that that area has the world's best cold water diving. You can debate that as long as you want, but you can't have that conversation without mentioning it. But they also make cold water diving easier than any other place I know. There's just
yeah,
the way they run things. It makes what's quite a hard thing to do as easy as it possibly can be, and that just makes it so pleasurable. It's generally all quite easy diving. You don't go far. The boats, they got the elevator to get you in and out of the water, but just the way they run things, it's all just really simple, really easy, and a very enjoyable place to visit. I did 35 dives on this trip, which is quite a lot in cold water. And the longest dive we did, actually, it was just through circumstance mainly, but we did the most minutes that any trip had ever done there by really quite a big margin. Because on the second week we had neap tides, so we had real flexibility to dive when we wanted to. We also, in the middle of the week, had 2 days of storm, which meant we could only dive inside the house reef of the resort, which is a bit limiting, but as a photography group, I have to say that it was actually very productive and everyone really enjoyed it. So those days we basically had kind of unlimited dive times. So we really racked up the minutes. But also because we knew the storm was coming on the days before, Brian, the skipper, said, if you guys are ready and you're quick, we can extend all the dive times, because they typically do a 60-minute dive time there. But the day before the storm, we did 3 80-minute dives on the boat.
Oh, nice.
That day. And which, was basically a whole extra dive. And 2 of those dives were on Browning Wall. And there were GPOs on both those dives. They were awesome dives, and wall bonnets and grunt sculpins and all that stuff as well. So it was really a fantastic trip. I think the other thing I want to talk about was camera gear and what to take up there. And this was the first trip where I had taken a wide angle zoom up there in the form of a WWL or WACP, or in my case on this trip, the FCP. And the FCP was almost one of the last things I packed, because before the trip, I took my Nikonos 13mm, which I was expecting to be the lens I used the most. And then I was also taking my 8-15 with the dome port, because I thought I might want to do some split levels and that sort of thing. And it's a good backup, because fisheye is so important up there. So I kind of had 2 fisheyes, and I'm like, do I really need, I've got a lot of stuff already. Do I really need the FCP as well? And I put it in at the last minute, and I'm so glad I did, because once I started using that lens up there, I absolutely loved it. And it's, we've talked about the FCP a lot on the channel, and it still interests me where I like it and where I don't like it. And the don't like it column is getting shorter and shorter. And I think the only reason that I wouldn't have the FCP on the camera all the time is that I feel sometimes when you have loads and loads of detail, fine detail, right in the corners of the frame, it doesn't always render that as well as a Nikonos 13 or a WACP does. However, I think that is only really visible when you're shooting low ISO tropical water pictures with corals right to the edges of the frame, and up in cold water. And I've certainly, I love the FCP for big animals. You don't see any image degradation at all with it with big animals. But I have to say also with cold water diving using slightly higher ISOs, I just don't see any big issue with it. And I was using it on this trip and just used it again and again and again. And I wrote down, I'm just going to read them out, what my percentages were with the different lenses for the shots that I've taken. So I just opened my Lightroom catalog and looked at the lenses. So I was pretty evenly split between wide angle and macro, but my most used lens with 38% of my pictures was FCP. And then my second most used lens was the Tamron 90 with 34%. So that's kind of my main macro wide split. The 13mm Nikonos 21%. So over 50% of my pictures were wide angle. And then I did 4% with the 8-15, which was really when I really wanted to do split levels, or was because often there you go on a dive and you're like, well, I know if I come up 10 minutes before the end of dive time on this dive site, I can do 10 minutes of split levels at the surface at the end. So that's when I was that's the one dive I would use the 8-15 for. And then I also used the Sony 90 5% of the time. So the FCP was my most used lens on the trip. And it was strangely the last one I packed. I think previously I'd always kind of gone, I'm happy just shooting fisheye here because the scenery is so amazing. But I think the FCP in this place really made its worth felt. And I was really happy I had it there. Nice. So yeah, on a gear front, I'd strongly recommend to anyone going there, you need to take a fisheye and you need to take a wide angle zoom. And if they're all in one lens, great. But if not, then it's going to be fisheye and WACP or WWL. And I definitely saw amongst the guests, who all followed that instruction, that a lot of them were using their WWLs or WACPs more than they were using their fisheyes.
I think especially because a lot of the as we touched on before, there's so much diversity of what you can see on each site. Yeah. And a lot of those subjects are conducive to multiple different kinds of like wolf eels, for example. You can shoot them big and in a scene, or you can zoom in tight and shoot just the gnarly faces. So I think something like that FCP probably is perfect up there. Especially if you're not really noticing an image degradation compared to other fisheyes. It's probably a really good way to go.
Yeah, and I think it's just probably just that slightly higher ISO, slightly murkier water, just those little things. And suddenly, what on a coral reef, I'm going, oh, I'm not quite think this is the very, very best that's available. Suddenly, the water and the conditions and the ISO have just shifted that back, and it's like I cannot see any significant difference anymore.
Yeah,
So
that's awesome.
yeah, really, really enjoyable trip. And yeah, those are my recommendations if you're going there in the future. Is make sure you've got good. And then on the macro front, I used the 90 mm. The MFO1 was on pretty much the whole time. I had the MFO3 on a flip, and that was great as well, having that flexibility. But I have to say, we had very good visibility. I didn't need the MFO3 as much as you might imagine, because I could always just clear water. I could always back off a little bit. There weren't. It was and I think a lot of the subjects there, because you have these colourful backgrounds, your best way of shooting things is kind of relatively more telephoto with shallow depth of field. So you can isolate the subject with a nice colourful background behind
Yeah,
it.
yeah,
And that plays into the realm of a 90 mm or a 100 mm, 105 mm lens more than it does into the MFO3, which would be a 50 or 60 mm lens. But obviously, when you're on all your macro dives and you keep finding GPOs, it is very nice to have
yeah,
an MFO3. So no,
for
it was a
sure.
wonderful trip. I'm already looking forward to going back.
Awesome. Well, I think I've exhausted my questions, at least for now. Last one. How many pictures did you take on the entire trip?
I went through 10,000. I'd say about 1,000 of those were topside, because there
Okay.
was, we saw humpback whales almost every day, sea
Yeah.
otters every day, sea lions, seals, eagles, all that stuff, and its beautiful surroundings, and bears as well. So yeah, about 1,000. My bear pictures are not as nice as your ones, though. So.
I look forward to seeing all the pictures you do end up posting or sharing, either here or on your website. So thank you guys for watching. Any questions for Alex about God's Pocket, please drop them in the comments below, and we'll see you guys next time.